All right, we're dealing with week 7 of the Sermon on the Mount, and what we want to try to do is to do both the overview of assignments very briefly. You have that listed in your syllabus. You have the specific instructions for it in the PowerPoint that's posted on the course documents, so you'll want to rely on that as you do your work. So I'll just mention what they are. What the assignments are. We're dealing with Matthew chapter 6, verses 5 through 15. This is what Jesus had to teach about prayer, and so that's what we want to focus on in this. So you have 2 assignments, and on Wednesday night your translation is due. You need to translate the passage following the rubric, the grading rubric, which you have in both your syllabus and in course documents, and so you want to follow that, and that is to be turned in on Wednesday night by midnight. And then the group will also work this week. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But the Saturday assignment has to do with an exegesis of the same passage, and then you will do phrasing according to Mounce's phrasing. I'll post my phrasing as well on week 7, and so you can take a look at that. You don't have to phrase it like I do, and I don't want you to use my phrasing as your work. I want you to do your own work, but as you do that phrasing, you certainly can check your work against that. It doesn't have to agree, because phrasing certainly is different as we look at different perspectives, but you do want to be faithful to the text and seek to look for the real meaning of the text as you deal with that. So exegesis, phrasing, and then the sermon outline as you are given instructions there. And that is to be posted on Saturday night. You also, on Saturday night, will need to post a response to the group and the report that they post. Their work is due on the same passage according to the group rubric, so be sure to pay very close attention to that. That's due on Friday night at midnight. It is essentially the same, except digging a little deeper. You have a group working together, and it is a collaborative report, and that is really what is involved there. That's what you want to work hard on. Work together. Let me know if there's any way that I can help you with getting your work done. Now what I'd like to do is to turn to this new section, which we have already begun just a little bit in the last week, but I want to talk a little bit about that just to remind you that it's the whole issue now where we are is on the practicing of the righteousness that Jesus has spoken of when he spoke in the Beatitudes. He spoke of the characteristics that we are to have as kingdom citizens, and those characteristics are his characteristics, the characteristics that he has demonstrated as he lived in his culture and impacted his culture, and that's what he wants us to have. He talked about kingdom citizens, and he dealt with then after those characteristics. He told us what we are and what we're to do. That's the salt and the light, and what's to come out of our lives as a result of that. And essentially it's to live like he lived in his culture, changing his culture and having an impact on the culture, and that's what we need to be doing. And then he begins to talk about the law and how Jesus is fulfilling the law in our lives as kingdom citizens, and how it is different. And the difference is, you will recall, is a transfer from looking simply at the activity, the things that we do in keeping the law, to the causal attitudes of our hearts, because it is the action of our lives comes out of that attitude. So what Jesus is reminding us is that we're working on his agenda, and as he speaks to that, he tells us that he sets the agenda and he gives the rewards for the agenda. The rewards of man are temporary and vain, but the rewards of the Father are much more serious. He speaks of rewards 7 times in chapter 6, verses 1 through 18. Now, the word means to give what is due, to pay wages. But what Jesus, I think, takes this a little bit further. What he's saying is that we practice the righteousness, and as we do so, men are not going to notice, but God will. And God is the one who's going to give the reward. Doesn't say he will reward us openly. Sometimes we see that translated in the text, but the text doesn't say that. It's not saying that he will reward us openly. He will reward us because he sees in secret, and he will reward us in a very genuine way. Heaven is not a recognition service. When we get to heaven, it's not going to be about us. It's going to be about him, and our focus is going to be on him. But right now, our responsibility is to carry out his will and purpose in our lives as we seek to do his will and as we seek to accomplish his purpose in getting things done, and then he will reward us. But remember, doing the job is the reward here. Knowing that we've done the job, that we've been obedient, that we've done what he has told us to do. And he'll take care of the future. Whatever reward he wants to give us, and however he wants to give us that reward, he will take care of that. And so we know that our ought for living, the reason we live, is in him. And that's what we need to be focused on. He began some examples of how we do this practicing of righteousness in verses 1 through 4 of chapter 6. And there he talks about the giving of alms. And that's what we want to, we looked at what we looked at last week. But this week we're going to be looking at the second example, and that example is the example of prayer. It's in verses 5 through 15 of chapter 6. So what is his agenda concerning prayer as it relates to us? How does he practice the righteousness of prayer in our lives? And as a result of his activity in our lives, then how do we practice that righteousness that he is working in us as we relate not only to him, but to other people as well? We need to understand this. We need to look at two things. We need to look, first of all, at men's ideas about prayer, and he talks about that. He suggests that what men say about prayer may be wrong. In fact, it very obviously is wrong. The problem is men are sometimes hypocritical. People are sometimes hypocritical. That's a very significant word here, and it's one that you, particularly in the group, ought to do a word study on to see where that came from and what it means. It comes from the Greek theater. And it's like that old saying that I used to hear when I was growing up about two-faced people, because it speaks of the actors who wore masks. And so the face that you saw in the play was not their real face. And that's the problem that sometimes happens in prayer, as Jesus says. Hypocrites stand to be noticed because the goal of their life is to be seen by men. And so they like to stand before the synagogue or speak in the church, do the big things so people will look at them and think well of them. They like to stand on the street corner so the crowd will notice them and know what they're doing. So the result of this is meaningless words, an emphasis on quantity rather than on quality of communication. They're seeking the reward, and Jesus says they get it. That's it. Because if you want men to notice you, they will notice you, but that's it. That's the end of the reward. His reward is quite different, because what he wants us to do is recognize the work that he is doing in us and then participate in that as he works his righteousness in us. So what is God's idea about prayer? That's the other thing we want to look at. It's an attitude of prayer. Again, he's carrying the same theme all the way through, because remember, our actions come out of our attitudes. And if we don't have the right attitude, then our actions are not going to be right. So listen to what he says. He starts out by saying, "Our Father who is in heaven." That's an intimate relationship that he's speaking of here. Our Father. And really it's the word, the Aramaic word, that it's kind of like the word that our kids use when they first learn to speak. I've been watching my two youngest granddaughters as they are beginning to make sounds, and about the only thing they can say clearly would be mama and dad. And that's this word here, dad. It's a simple, intimate term that we would use of our earthly father. And so it's an intimate relationship. But then he says, our Father who is in heaven. So there's an otherness about this. There's a holiness about this. And we need to have a balance here, because we need to understand that this holy God who is different from us also wants to relate to us and wants us to relate to him. And so as we pray to him, that's what he wants the relationship to be. So he says, our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Let your name be honored, not only in our lives, but in the lives of other people as well. Let your kingdom come is the next thing he talks about. Kingdom is the rule of God in the hearts of his people. And we need to make sure we understand that very clearly. It's a general term that applies to our relationship with God. And then he says, let your will be done. The will is the purpose of God being worked out in the world, and that's what he wants us to be participating in, being a part of that. And then he says something that's very significant, and we sometimes miss this when we read through this. He says, let your kingdom come, let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So what he wants to be happening is that his kingdom and his will, his purpose is being worked out right now in the world as we live here and as we be obedient. Then he moves on to talk about our daily needs. Give us the things we need every day. I think that's the sense of what he's trying to say there, because it's not a matter of piling things up for the future, but it's a matter of taking care of our needs on a daily basis. And then he moves to something very serious when he says, forgive us our sins as we forgive others who sin against us. Word's a little stronger than the general word for sin. Trespasses is what is said here, but it is the point that he's making is we get forgiveness as we give forgiveness. One scholar talked about this. He said, when a door is shut, it's shut on both sides. So if we can't give forgiveness through the door, we can't receive forgiveness through the door. It's not a matter of God not being able to forgive us. God can do anything he wants to, but we can't receive it unless we're willing to have that attitude of forgiveness. Then he says, don't lead us into temptation. And that could be either a prayer of protection against Satan tempting us, or it could be a prayer of seeking protection against trials that come to our lives. And probably some of both may be involved in it. But here's the thing we need to remember, and that is Satan is a threat to us. And he's going around seeking whom he may devour, that's for sure, as the text says. But we also need to remember that he's been defeated. And the only authority that Satan can have in our lives is the authority as Christians. The only authority that he can have in our lives as Christians is the authority that we grant to him. And so we need to make sure that we are understanding that and relating to God in such a way that we relate to Satan in the right way as well. So one thing we can be sure about is that this word that he's using here when he says don't lead us into temptation or trials has to do with forgiveness, because forgiveness is spoken of before it and forgiveness is spoken of after it. Then he moves to the behavior of prayer, and that's in verse 6 where he talks about the inner room. And the metaphor inner room is simply, this is a private matter. It's a private communication with God. Whether you're praying alone at your home, in your closet, or whatever your praying place may be, or whether you're praying in public, you need to be isolated so that you are alone with God. Your thoughts are not on the thoughts of others who are around you and who are listening to you, but knowing that your audience is God and you are seeking to communicate with him. Remember, prayer is communication, not